So we come to painting. And painting, generally speaking, is where we're getting into the wet mediums, where we're dealing with multiple colors. But again, there's not a really good definition, since these days there are solid forms of paint and liquid forms of drawing materials. But sort of as a rule, if it's applied with a brush, we're going to be dealing with it as a painting. And there's several forms I want to go over and just kind of familiarize you with. First is oil painting. Now, oil painting is pigment mixed with various oils. The advantage is the colors remain vibrant. They don't darken like acrylics do. And because they take quite some time to dry, the artist can go back and work with them afterwards. So it could be a week or a month before a painting is dry. It could be months before a painting is dry, giving the artist a lot of time to work with detail. Now, these paints appear around the 14th or 15th century in Northern Europe, and they'll move down into Italy from there. Then we have watercolor. Now, watercolor is taking pigment, mixing it with gum arabic, which is a binder, something that glues the pigment to the surface of the paper. None of these pigments absorb into the paper. They always sit on the surface. Then you mix that with water to create your paints. Now, watercolors can be a real pain. If you've ever dealt with them in grade school or high school, you know that they muddy easily and they take a lot of work to master. But if you do master them, you get some phenomenal results. They have a translucency that gives it a sense of life, and we'll get a better sense of that in a couple of minutes. Now, watercolor was developed so that artists could create studies. In other words, they could do little sketches in color out in the real world and then bring those back to the studio where they would incorporate them into a painting. Today, watercolors are often used as a finished product in and of themselves. Then we have tempera. Tempera is not the stuff that you used in preschool or grade school. That is some abomination that I don't understand. This tempera is an egg-based paint. So you're going to use egg, honey, and water and mix that with pigment to create a paint. The egg is necessary because it again binds the pigment to the surface that you're working on. Now, tempera dries very rapidly, maybe 20 minutes tops, so you don't do a lot of blending. But we see a lot of pieces during the Renaissance coming out of Italy that are going to be in tempera, including some of the more famous ones that we'll be looking at later on in the class. The advantage is it dries quickly. It's pretty easy to work with. The disadvantage is the egg goes off very quickly, so you have to remix your paints almost every day, and it doesn't blend really well. So you have to be very cautious with your brushwork, which is why this will be replaced eventually with oil paints. Then we have acrylic. And acrylic is very modern. It was only invented in about the 1950s. And acrylic paint is really plastic. It's basically plastic, water, and pigment. And when it dries, it turns into that solid plastic that we know it for. And if you've ever gone to your house, maybe your parents' place, and you peeled paint off the wall, it's probably because it was a latex or acrylic paint laid over oil. They don't bond really well. But it does have its advantages. It works very much like tempera, except the blending is a little bit easier. It dries in about 20 to 30 minutes. And here we see a comparison, the same image created with acrylics and watercolors. And you see the acrylics have beautiful color, but it's just not as lively and vibrant. It lacks the translucence that we get from the watercolor. And that watercolor has a little more life than the acrylic. But acrylic is also used for underpainting. So today, oil paints are very expensive. Oftentimes, you can spend $20 to $30 for one tube of paint. So what many artists will do is they'll do, say, 75 or 80% of the painting in acrylic, and then they'll paint over it with oil, because you can always put oil paints on top of acrylic, but you cannot put acrylic on top of oil. Then we have Fresco. Now, fresco is painting in wet plaster at its most basic level. Basically, the pigments are mixed with water and then applied to plaster. And it doesn't really absorb, but I don't want to go into too much of the chemistry. But it creates a very permanent image that really can only be destroyed with a hammer or maybe a flood, maybe a fire. There are two forms of fresco that we see. There's dry fresco, called fresco secco, which is painting on dry plaster. In that case, you need to mix egg with it or some other form of binder to attach the pigment. And then there's true fresco, buon fresco, which is when you're painting on wet plaster. The limiting factor here is the fact that the fresco must be finished, or at least the section you're working on must be finished in a 3 to 4 hour period before the plaster dries. As soon as it dries, you can't work on it anymore. You have to scrape all the excess off, replaster what hasn't been painted, and start again. This really makes it remarkable because at the Sistine Chapel, for example, the images by Michelangelo, each of those large figures is one piece. So he's doing each one in a 3 to 4 hour segment. So it's a fantastic form, fantastic media, but we don't see it much today because it takes a lot of technical skill. And part of that is the application of the paint, because you can't blend paint in a fresco. You actually have to add layers, very subtle layers of color, which you see on the right here. Then we have encaustic. Encaustic means that you're painting with basically molten wax. Usually pigment mixed with, today it's paraffin wax, but in the past it's been beeswax or any number of other things. If you've ever melted a crayon on a light bulb or in the backseat of your parents' car or something like that, it's exactly the same thing. You're painting with that. Now, it's incredibly permanent, which is good because you need a heat source to take it over 140 degrees to destroy it. On the other side, it becomes difficult to work with because it has to constantly be over 140 degrees in order to work with. It also doesn't blend well. So oftentimes you'll use palette knives or some kind of iron spatula to move it around. Today, a lot of people use electric griddles to keep their paints warm. And here we have an example that we'll be looking at later in the class by Jasper Johns, where he's used that encaustic to create this very permanent image of the flag. And encaustics are still available today. You don't have to buy Crayola crayons. You can actually go to Dick Blick's or other art supply stores and buy blocks of encaustic wax to use for these projects. Finally, we have mixed media, which is where we see drawings and paintings where we see different forms, different medias, different materials used. In this case, we have quite a few that are used, actually. Here we have some charcoal in the hair. We have a gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, usually white, that's used here. We have some pen and ink with the drawing. We have some watercolor, likely watercolor there. We have some pencil used in the face. So we have a number of different media being used based on their strengths, which hopefully you have some feeling for at this point.